They traveled there together to break into Sean Taylor's home and steal his money. He said that they didn't really expect anyone to be home at the time, but they were there. They heard a noise. They went back outside, convinced themselves it was one of them that had made the noise. But they hadn't come all that way for nothing, so they went back in. Rivera had his gun to his side. They believed the money must be locked in the master bedroom. So they went to the master bedroom. He kicked the door in. And as this was happening, Sean Taylor was on the other side of the door, holding something in his hands. Rivera shot him. He said that he could see someone with something in his hands, so he shot. Regardless of whether he intended to kill Sean Taylor, he shot him while he was committing an armed burglary. He shot out the sliding glass door so he and his friends could escape. He tells the police. And not only does he tell them what he did, but by about 2:15 p.m., he had drawn a diagram himself of the house, where the rooms were, and where he was while this all happened. When Rivera confessed, he was no longer free to leave, and he was going to be taken into custody. So the detectives made arrangements to contact his parents, which they did. They even arranged to personally go pick up the defendant's father, Eric Rivera Sr., and bring him back to FDLE. They asked Rivera if he was willing to give a tape-recorded statement, and he agreed. You will actually see a videotaped recording of this defendant confessing to the murder of Sean Taylor. And it's not just a video of him saying, "I shot Sean Taylor." No, he describes in detail the plan, how they carried it out, who was involved, everything. You will also see him say on that video that he was not threatened or coerced or mistreated in any way to get him to make that statement. It was free and voluntary. He confessed to what he had done. The defendant then had an opportunity to meet with his father privately. They spoke. And at some point later on, much later, a court reporter, much like this young lady here, prepared a transcript of the videotaped confession. The defendant had an opportunity to sit down and review that transcript, which he did. He initialed every page. He had a chance to make corrections, if there were any to be made. This was long after having an opportunity to speak to his father. It was long after he had confessed to the police what he had done, and he had a chance to think about it and reflect on it. In addition to describing how he shot Sean Taylor, the defendant also describes how he got rid of the murder weapon, which is lost in the Everglades. How he and his friends burned their clothes, all to try and destroy physical evidence of their guilt. How they all went together to the home of a girl named Ariel Boston, as I told you about. But nothing can hide the fact that this defendant confessed to the murder of Sean Taylor, that he committed. And there are some things he forgot about. You will see the other evidence in this case. There were footprints found on the scene. Right next to the gate in front of the house, there's an electrical box for the gate and a motor cover that covers the motor for that gate. Footprints were found on top of that box, on top of that motor cover. You will see that box, and you will see that motor cover. The defendant described to the police the type of shoes that he was wearing that night. A pair of Nike Shox sneakers. Footprints consistent with that type of sneaker were found on that electrical box. Now you will hear that there were many partial and overlapping footprints, which made it somewhat difficult. However, you can clearly see on that footprint some of the letters for the Nike Shox sneaker. In fact, when the evidence was reviewed by an expert at the Miami-Dade Police Department, he was able to determine the kind of shoe that had made that print. So you know what he did? He got a picture of it, and he sent it to the detective. And the detective, while he was still speaking to Eric Rivera, showed him a picture of those shoes and said, "Are these the kind of shoes you were wearing?" He said, "Yes, those are them." He signed that photograph. You will see pry marks on the door that leads out to the patio in the pool. You will see the wood splintered on the ground from where they tried to break in. You will see a photo of the master bedroom door that the defendant kicked, which also has a footprint, and which you will hear is consistent with the kind of shoe the defendant was wearing. It has the same herringbone pattern. And one of the most important pieces of evidence that you will see comes as a result of something that people take for granted every day: your cell phone. You see, when you make a call on your cell phone, it sends a signal to the nearest of those many large cell towers that we see as we're driving down the street or the highway. And a record is kept. A record of not only the calls you make, but of which tower your phone was closest to. You will have an opportunity to see the phone records for the defendant, Eric Rivera, Jason Mitchell, and Charles Wardlow. And you will see, based on the locations of those cell towers, that those phones and the burglars who owned them traveled all the way down from Fort Myers to Miami and back on the night of the murder. Not only that, right at around 1:45 in the morning, two of the phones, those of Jason Mitchell and Charles Wardlow, send a signal to the tower that's closest to Sean Taylor's home. You will also see the trail of calls all the way back to Fort Myers. They were using their phones, making calls, and it was all being recorded. Little did they realize. You will also see a photograph of the black Toyota Highlander that they were driving. And it's a photograph that was taken as it ran through one of those sun-passed holes on Alligator Alley at 2:42 in the morning when they were headed back to Fort Myers. You will also learn that not long after the defendant was arrested in this case, he began to panic. He knew how important it was that he had been seen at the home of Ariel Boston that night, together with the other people he committed this crime with. He knew how important it was that they all showed up together to her house right around 4 in the morning after coming back from Miami. He was also worried about who else among his friends might be talking. He was worried about who else among his friends might be talking. The other people he was arrested with. So the defendant wrote a letter. He wrote a letter to his cousin, Jairus Bryce. And in that letter, he asked his cousin to try and get close to Ariel Boston, to convince her not to testify truthfully in this case, not to cooperate with police. Fortunately for her, for everyone, except the defendant, Jairus Bryce was found in possession of that letter before anything happened during a traffic incident. You will see that letter written by the defendant. And not only that, you will learn that his DNA is on that envelope. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant and his friends had a plan that night, and they carried it out. They thought no one would be home that night, but this defendant brought a gun just in case. This was a burglary that turned into a murder, and it never would have happened if they had not all agreed to get in that truck, drive down to Miami, and burglarize Sean Taylor's home. At the conclusion of all the evidence in this case, you will be convinced, after you listen to the witnesses, their testimony, and view all of the evidence, that this defendant is guilty of armed burglary and guilty of first-degree felony murder. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today because the detectives at the Miami-Dade Police Department were in such a rush and were under such pressure to close this investigation that they forced my client to give a statement, and they forced him to confess to this crime that he did not commit.
Overruled. Continue.
Now, in order to fully understand what occurred, there are 2 days that we should focus on. The first day is the date of Mr. Taylor's death. And the evidence will show that my client had gotten a ride from his friend Charles Wardlow. They were hanging out like they always did, and my client overheard Mr. Wardlow and some other individuals discussing going to Miami. Now, the evidence will show that my client, Mr. Rivera, did not want to go. He went to his girlfriend's house. He asked if he could spend the night with his girlfriend. She said no. His girlfriend's mother said no, he couldn't stay there. He tried to call his sister for a ride so he could go home. His sister did not answer the phone. He could not get in touch with his parents. And that's why my client went to Miami. And that's all he did, was go to Miami with his friends. Now, Mr. Taylor died, and it was a very unfortunate situation. He was a hero to several people, not only here in Miami, but across the country. Several people had followed his career from when he was in high school to college, and then he made it pro and was a professional athlete in the National Football League. He was a hero to many. And in the days after the shooting, there were several reporters at his house. There were several celebrities that were commenting about his death. It was a huge event here locally. And you will also hear that in the days and hours following his death, the Miami detectives had absolutely no lead. They had no idea of anywhere to go forward with their investigation until they received an anonymous tip that someone called into the police department. You will also hear that those detectives made a deliberate plan. They were going to find these individuals and they were going to bring them in for questioning. So the detectives, they called ahead to Florida Department of Law Enforcement. They asked for other officers to go undercover and help them to locate these individuals. Now, you will also hear that before they went to Fort Myers, they had names of the individuals they wanted to speak with. Obviously, as detectives, they have the means to find their addresses, their phone numbers, their parents, and you will also hear that my client, Eric Rivera, was 17 years old at the time. He was a student in high school. He was a member of his football team. And none of this was a secret or a surprise. Now you will hear that instead of simply going to Mr. Rivera's home and asking to speak with him, or calling Mr. Rivera's house and trying to speak with him, or calling his cell phone, or even going to the school and speaking to Mr. Rivera at school, that the detectives from the Miami-Dade Police Department made a plan to ambush him. And that's exactly what happened. You will hear that on November 30th, my client, Mr. Rivera, was on his way to school. He was with his friend Charles Wardlow, and he was with two of his cousins. He went into the house because he forgot something. He came back out, got into the car, and as soon as they were driving away from the house, they were ambushed by detectives from Miami-Dade Police Department, by officers from Fort Myers Police Department, as well as plainclothes undercover detectives. Mr. Rivera, my client, was asked to get out of the car. His cell phone was taken from him, and he was told he was going downtown for a questioning. Now, and you will hear about the number of detectives that were there, and you will also hear about the circumstances of my client being taken, not to a local police station or to the jail, but he was taken to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Now, it's important that he was taken to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement because most people in Fort Myers did not know where that location was. And you will hear that a neighbor saw my client, Mr. Rivera, being taken into custody. And that neighbor called his parents and said the police just...
Sustained.
And you will hear that Eric's father went to the jail to look for Eric. He went to the local police station to look for Eric. He went to the sheriff's department to look for Eric. And Eric was not in any of those places because he was at Florida Department of Law Enforcement being forced to give a confession by the officers. Now, you will also hear that they never called Mr. Rivera's parents as soon as he was taken to Florida Department of Law Enforcement. They never contacted anyone from the school to let the school officials know where he was. And he was not allowed to call anyone himself because he did not have his cell phone. After several hours of being in the room, the detectives told Eric, "We found a shoe print of Nike shops on the door." They told him other information that was not disclosed to the media. You will hear they also told Mr. Rivera that his family was in danger. They told him, "There are people who love Sean Taylor who will hurt your family if you're responsible for this." They told Mr. Rivera that his mother was taken by an ambulance to the hospital. And when he asked to call to see how his mother was doing and if she was okay, they told him he couldn't use the phone, they wouldn't let him talk to anyone until they were done with him. And you will hear it's only at that point that my client said anything about being involved with the burglary that occurred on November 27th. Now, after my client gave his statement, and only after he confessed did they call his parents. And they brought his father to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Now, they simply could have given his father the address and told him to come on his own, but they brought him there so they could take even more time with Eric before his parents could intervene. And even though they hadn't gone on the record yet and done the official videotape statement, they still did not let Eric talk to his father until after they made him say everything on camera that they forced him to say behind closed doors. Now, you will hear that before Mr. Rivera was ambushed and taken to FDLE, the detectives already had planned. They were going to try and find all of the individuals, bring them in for questioning. And ladies and gentlemen, as you listen to the evidence in this case and to the testimony, do not forget your common sense at the door. Focus on not only what you hear, but what you don't hear. And focus on whether or not things made sense. If they knew ahead of time that they were going to bring them in for questioning, if they knew ahead of time they were going to bring them in for questioning, why didn't they have the rooms already set up to be videotaped? If they knew ahead of time they were going to bring them in for questioning, why didn't they try to contact the parents of the ones who were juveniles? Or why didn't they make arrangements for them to have attorneys available? And ladies and gentlemen, when you focus on the evidence of the case, remember that this was an extremely difficult situation for the Taylor family. And they were under a lot of pressure. There were a lot of people who were in mourning over Mr. Taylor's death. And as soon as they had my client to make this confession, the detectives did nothing else. They never tried to find the individual who you will hear during the course of this burglary. As they were driving from Miami, there was an individual on the phone giving directions. You will hear that the Miami detectives never tried to find out who that individual was. And based on the statements that Mr. Rubin made during jury selection, we all know that person would be just as guilty. Now, we also know that the detectives were not under any deadline to make an arrest or to find evidence. And we ask that when you look at the evidence in this case, you focus not only on what you're being shown, but what is not there. And the judge will instruct you at the conclusion of this case that reasonable doubt is found based on the evidence itself, conflicts in the evidence, but most importantly, the lack of evidence. And ladies and gentlemen, at the conclusion of this case, once you've seen all of the evidence and you've heard all of the testimony, we are confident that you will find my client, Eric Rivera, not guilty because he is not guilty of these offenses. Thank you.
All right, members, you've been here since about 9:30 when I asked you to be here this morning. This is probably a good time to break for lunch. If you will assemble where Ralph asked you to at 1:15, we'll get you down here and start with the presentation of the evidence right after lunch. Again, the same instructions apply during lunch. Don't discuss the case with anyone. Don't let anyone discuss the case in your presence. If you see us out and about, then we ignore you. We're not being rude. We just can't handle contact with you. Enjoy your lunch, and we'll assemble again at 1:15.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, would you pass your tablets forward, please? We'll hold it for you during lunch. And please make sure you have all your personal belongings with you. And we're going to meet you at 1:15 back in the jury pool on the 7th floor. Just return and say, I'm here for Judge Dennis Murphy, and go on inside and wait for me at the inside the jury pool. Thank you.
Any matters we need to bring up before we adjourn for lunch?
Just two quick things.
Okay.
The other thing is you would ask for copies of some depositions.
Yeah.
So I want some with me.
Okay.
Show them to the defense. There's one of them that we're going to get this. The next thing is, as you know, we've had some issue with our main crime scene technician being here. So there's a sketch I would like to be able to use with the first witness before the crime scene technician. Is there any issue with that? I think it's a crime scene sketch. Just to designate which ones we take.
No. Judge, for the record, the defense at this time invokes the rule of sequestration.
All right. Since the state knows who the witnesses are and aren't, let's make sure that those witnesses don't talk with each other. I want to real quick just address family and friends of both the defendant and the victim, if you want to proceed for a moment. I've been doing this for about 30 years. I'm on the bench for 13 and practicing for about 18 as a trial lawyer in trial. The one thing I can tell you for sure is that behavior from the audience by a juror, you'll never know how they react to it. You all are welcome to be here throughout the course of the proceedings. My hope is that you will conduct yourselves appropriately, because any sort of animation, gesture, reaction to testimony or argument will be seen by the jury, and you'll never know how they react to it. So just keep that in mind. You're welcome to be here. Thank you for all coming. We'll see you all at 1:15 and continue on with the testimony, or begin with the testimony.
All right.
Well, we're going to be live.
Same question.
Yes.
Yes, Judge, I'll take that. Watch yourself. Yes, we'll be off. But I want you to come to the end, okay? All right, I'm walking.
You're not going to get to talk to anybody. There's gag orders in effect. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we'll lock in the courtroom. Okay, talk right outside. You're going to walk out that door, but unlock the courtroom. The jury's coming back to upstairs. Okay. Where are you going?
one representing a picture of each bedroom. Let's take these over there. There'll be the photo. And I should have tags on some.
No luck?
No. Let me just see if I can all these here. Those are projected to.
Okay, yeah. No, no, there's, yeah.
I don't see anything here.
But, no, no, it's not.
You need an easel, right?
Yeah.
Never mind.
Thank you, sir. Slow it down. Oh, okay. Thank you. Oh, I want the team. Yeah. So if it's sent to my phone, I can just eat and come back. All right. Yeah, they can.
Do you need anything? You don't need anything, brother?
I don't think I remember any of the stickers you said, so it should be like.
Yeah, it's
posted and-
Like a lot of the pictures, we just do it.
That's what I'm saying, wherever you have to get your jacket. This is all grossly stealing, so. This is a big one. You need to remove whatever one for the walking. You want the area for Jackie also, or you see?
If I have the sketch thing, I think that'll be okay.
Okay. Oh, we're not introducing this, you want me to bring it into walk-ins or no?
You can bring it in for somebody else.
Okay.
We'll just see what's inside. Hey, Ray, take a look at these pictures for me for a second.
I'm sorry?
Take a look at these pictures for me in a second. Sasha is
Sasha's, that's all right.
one sketch over there already? Oh, you already have it. There's two sketches?
I have a big sketch that shows the bedroom layout. That's really what I want to do with her.
Okay.
We should have a good picture of the couch. Facing over with.
A big one? Yeah. I think it's over here.
Let's see where I can lay these so I can kind of see them as I go along. It's really difficult to not be able to put the over. So if you find stuff like that, it's going to have like the inches now. Very much stuff like that. Should be one small picture. Should be one big picture. Right there a second.
Thanks for keeping me in.
Yeah, try that.
Here it is. Then there should be a picture of him on a lawnmower. Now, can you look at
This isn't my courtroom. You want it right now?
No, I don't need to write the second one as long as before testimony starts.
Oh, no, I'll have gloves. I've got to find an easel. I'm going to put extra water up.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
a picture of him on a lawnmower?
I didn't see it there. I know which one you're talking about. Let me check back in the office.
Just let me remind you that while we're not in session, some of these mics may be live.
That's good to you.
You mean line going back into the,
It could be. Because when I was walking in the back hall, there was nobody there, but the machine is still on. And I couldn't understand what she was saying, but I heard something, so I was making you all aware of it.
where'd you hear it from?
Not when I walk by the desk in the back hallway. Just keeping everybody.
All right, so we're missing,
This is one more picture, for sure.
this is hard.
It's probably the outside. Remember the, I don't think he mounted it, did he? No.
What is this? A picture. Be a picture of Sean Taylor with a lawnmower with his daughter. There's no room there.
I saw one of him, the girl on the.
Yeah, no, it's not that one.
Okay.
So let me see. James, I'm also going to need you to mark these two photos.
Yeah.
Leave them out. Like, I won't need a picture of him until the afternoon, but a tattoo on me right away. So I'll get here and play with it.
Okay.
So here we go. This is one little picture.
You're giving all these also for this one. For some of these, but anytime these things go out, you're
Cells. This one is.
You can see that here, I can see you.
Yeah.
Yes, it's Josh in. I was wondering if Josh is here.
Picture, look forward to it back. Got a picture of the window on the back. The big clean shot of the back. It's here. Yeah, on that. So I'll need these in the action. You just like leave them like that.
Show me this one, too.
Maybe there's a place shut the door as well. On the outside, so we'll just use this one. It's not really, it's sure.
It's my dad, the man told Dave to handle it. My first day back, I should have took off.
See if anybody can see the witness stand with that. The elmow's gonna have to be moved while the witness is testifying.
What we doing?
So we'll have to do that when we get back and set an easel.
Oh, okay. Oh.
They can just slide back here.
Go ahead. No, I'm just listening. Who was this that was gonna eat some?
She should be asked.
I think right here is fine.
That's good.
These over here, and just show her the sketch and then we'll move there. So we're down one photo total?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, one I took?
Yeah.
Just kind of set it up in front of the elmo for now, I'll come back for it.
Okay.
I do not like him rap, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry?
I can't stand that attorney.
Which one? That one there?
Yeah.
Reed Rubin?
Oh, God, I can't stand him. I cannot stand him.
Just for your information. It's Sean's seat. Chair from over here.